Today's talk is on the Aeneid by Virgil, duty-bound to family, fate, and country. It's an enduring story that we've been following this through time. So it started in 1300 BC with the Trojan War, which is thought to be a real war. And then about 600 years later, Homer writes his Iliad. And you can see here the first point on the map. Troy is over near Istanbul. He then writes the sequel to that, the Odyssey, just 25 years later. And whilst the Iliad is about a war that's waged by the Greeks against the Trojans, the Odyssey is a 10-year return home by Odysseus to his faithful wife Penelope, and eventually he ends up in Ithaca. 300 years later, Aristotle writes his Poetics, which was the topic of the third Soulday Thursday, and that was written in Athens, Greece, which at the time was the centre of all literary and cultural endeavours. Fast forward another 300 years and Virgil writes his Aeneid. This is significant because whilst the previous books have all been written in Greek, Virgil writes his Aeneid in Latin, and the reason for that is at the same time as us shifting from Istanbul across to Italy, we also have a shift in power from the Greeks to the Romans, and with it the language from Greek to Latin. So Virgil's writing his Aeneid in Latin. He's telling the story of a character called Aeneid who left Troy as it was in its ultimate ruin, and then goes on to found Rome, which is the subject of the Aeneid. So we've got a continual story running through. And in future Soulday Thursdays, we will cover Dante's Divine Comedy, which is written in 1320. That's interesting because it was written in Italian rather than in Latin. And that was around the time of the Italian Renaissance. It influenced many other writers who chose to write in Italian as opposed to in Latin. And in the Divine Comedy, the character there takes the Aeneid with him down into the Underworld. So you can see this story continuing. Then we'll move to Paradise Lost, which again is a similar story in terms of a structure, a battle between good and evil, and it's questioning what it means to, what the Underworld could be after we die. And then right up to James Joyce's Ulysses. Ulysses is the Latin translation of Odysseus. So it's an enduring story, it's a thread that runs all the way through, and these are some of the most influential books in Western culture. The Roman imagination building on Homeric foundations. So the Iliad written by Homer, the Odyssey written by Homer. In the Iliad, Troy is defeated by the Greeks, and Achilles, who is a Greek, kills Hector, who is a Trojan. It's one of the main moments in the story. And then again, with the Odyssey, Odysseus returns home, and we've got many-mindedness prevails. And the reason why I'm saying that is that whilst Achilles kills Hector because he's the best man, he's the strongest, Odysseus manages to get home not because he's the strongest, but because he's the most resourceful, because he's got ways of getting round his obstacles, which is partly why in today's reading Odysseus is often seen as an anti-hero. He's not trusted because he's a trickster. And in the opening line of the Aeneid, we've got, I sing of arms and of a man. And the arms is a reference to Troy being defeated by the Greeks, so the Iliad. And of a man is a reference to Odysseus in the Iliad. So quite clearly, right from the outset, Virgil is saying, I'm building on that which has come before, and I owe a debt to Homer. I'm paying homage to Homer. And Aeneas is picking up the Trojan mantle from Hector, who has died. You expect the Trojans to descend into nothingness, but Aeneas has survived, and he will then go on to found Rome. And some people say that whilst the Iliad and the Odysseus and the Odyssey are the primary text, the greatest epics, because Aeneas is founding the whole of Rome as opposed to getting home to seeing his family or defeating Hector, it's more superior in content than the Iliad and the Odyssey. So we've said that Aeneas will build Rome, and it's about a sense of public duty. So it's him doing something greater than himself rather than just for what he wants. And in terms of the history around the story, it's interesting to note that the Romans enslaved many Greeks and employed them as teachers. So even though Rome had sort of conquered the Greeks and was founding its new empire, they took lots of the Greek teachers and said, "Can you teach my children?" And that's partly why Homer has continued to this day. And it's also partly, and we'll mention it again later, it's also partly because the Romans believed in assimilating culture. So when they took a place, they didn't decimate everything that was involved with that place. They would bring it into their own way of being. And Horace notes on this idea of the Greeks then teaching the Romans by saying Greece has conquered her rude conqueror. Summary of the Aeneid for anyone who doesn't know the story. So it starts with fate, with the idea that Aeneas must be the father of Rome. He has no choice in that matter. And despite that, he's spending time with Dido, who's the queen of Carthage. And the Carthaginians, looking at history as opposed to the story, were at war with the Italians. So it was quite wrong for Aeneas to be dallying about with Dido. So he gets this sense of civic duty, this feeling like he has to go, and he abandons Dido. Dido is not best pleased. She takes her own life. And then for Aeneas to found Rome, he has to pass into the Underworld to get to Italy. And he returns through the Gate of Dreams as a Roman. We'll go back to why it's relevant that he goes through the Gate of Dreams. So pious Aeneas is fated to marry a lady called Lavinia, but the trouble is that she is already with a guy called Turnus, and she is his fiancée. So you can imagine he's not best pleased. A battle ensues, and ultimately Aeneas kills Turnus. I don't know whether it's Turnus or Turnus, or I'm not too sure, but that's a broad brush story of how the Aeneid unfolds. Some of the themes that we see piety, this duty to state and country. We see conflict coming up over and over, empire with Rome, fate and obeying it, and betrayal, huge betrayal, a shocking betrayal. The rumour, if we heard something like this happening today, would be outstanding. Aeneas and Virgil redefining a story. Virgil is a storyteller, and he knows that stories can paint pictures how they wish to paint them. And he recognises that the haters see Aeneas as someone who fled Troy as it was collapsing. He wasn't there fighting to the bitter end. And so, in Roman culture at the time of Virgil writing, there was a view that shared by Turnus, one of the characters in the book, that I'll dispatch this Trojan traitor. His mother won't be lurking near in swirls of empty mist to cover his retreat in an unmanly cloud. And that's referencing a moment in the Iliad where Diomedes is fighting with Aeneas, and it's clear that Aeneas is going to lose. So his mother, Aphrodite, I believe, comes down and takes him away. So he's seen as a coward, really, in an earlier story. But then Virgil arrives, and he's writing this book for, well, not strictly for, but partly for Emperor Augustus, Octavian, Caesar Augustus. And it's about setting a rubric for Roman culture that would follow. And there was a myth at the time, whether or not it's true remains to be seen, that Octavian Augustus is a direct descendant of Aeneas, which is partly why he's now redefining the way that Aeneas is seen and saying, actually, he's pious Aeneas, who must be the father of Rome. He's dutiful. Okay, he might have left, but he left because he was fated to greatness. your son will wage war in Italy and give them walls and customs. This was the idea that he will go on and take the Roman Empire right up eventually to, Hadrian, taking it to Hadrian's Wall. And it's interesting to note that Pius comes before Aeneas. And that's an idea that you see all the way through the Iliad and also the Odyssey, where you get the word describing the character just before the character. And it's saying that they're essentially like this. You could be like mischievous Oliver Trace, might be a way that I was described at school. But he was never described as pious in the Iliad or the Odyssey. And now he's being described as essentially pious. So he's reframing the story. Rome rising from the ashes. Even in defeat, they can't lay down the sword. This is one of the lines, and it's referencing the Trojans who, even though they've been defeated, they're going to rise up again and create the Roman Empire. The hero wasn't scared by falling. He came back fiercer. Being last means disgrace. Fight it, men. Avoid this ignominy. And then one more line by Turnus, fortune favours the brave. All of these lines are calls to action. They're Roman optimism, saying it doesn't matter what your circumstances are, you need to go for it. And you can imagine if you've got that underpinning a Roman army, they're going to push themselves to extreme. But it's worth noting that Turnus has been given the line, fortune favours the brave, as he's just about to fight Aeneas. But he gets killed by Aeneas. So there's Virgil saying, look, this is what I believe to be true, but the opposite is also true. The Roman optimism, they believe they're fated for good things, like Aeneas, who's going to rise from the ashes. They have a cyclical view of history. So with the Greek imagination, there was generally a view that it all descends into chaos. First of all, you've got Troy that gets defeated by the Greeks. And then you've got Odysseus who's on his way home and his household has collapsed whilst he hasn't been there to keep things in check. Whereas with the Romans, they said, okay, look, you can collapse, but you'll come back up again. And it then creates the feeling that there's always hope. A golden era can return. And as mentioned previously, they're cultural assimilators. Diomedes says a line where he goes, both men excelled in bravery and skill in battle, Aeneas in piety. And here, Diomedes is talking about Hector in relation to Aeneas. And when you're reading the Iliad, it's quite clear that Aeneas is not as great as Hector. Hector's the brave one who goes and fights Achilles even though he knows he's going to lose. But here, Diomedes is saying, well, wait, we forgot about the piety, we forgot about how dedicated Aeneas is to founding Rome. Once more, Aeneas is not named as pious in Homer's epics. Roman piety through impiety. This is a contradiction that comes up again and again. So Horace, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. How sweet and fitting it is to die for one's country. That's a summation of this idea of piety, that you do something, you have a duty to that which is greater than yourself. And at the beginning of the story, in fact, up to book 6, Aeneas is off track. According to Virgil, lust is winning. First of all, he's wondering about like Odysseus, who's the trickster, who's entrusted by the Romans, and he's frolicking with Dido, the enemy. So the gods are not pleased. They say this is not why his mother saved him twice from battle. Unmindful of their kingdom's slaves to shameful lust is reference to both Dido and Aeneas. They're having a lovely time on the beach, but they're meant to be in command of their respective empires. Aeneas gets wind of this position and gets a sense that he needs to leave Dido. So he does. He leaves the love of his life in order to set up Rome. Now he's back on track. He's aligned with fate. And he says to Dido, look, I'm leaving. I make for Italy, but not of my free will. It's a simple way out. But it's a private betrayal for a public loyalty. And in madness's grip, Dido decides on death. Her grief has won. Here we have Augustus Caesar, born of gods, who bring a golden age to Latium. I'm not sure which one. I actually checked it just before starting this. But yeah, this is Virgil dropping in Augustus, his emperor in Rome, to say how great he is, because Aeneid has a mother who's a goddess, and therefore, given Caesar as a direct descendant of Aeneid, he's also born of gods. And you can imagine it's putting their emperor on a pedestal. The Underworld and the Aeneid, building on Homer. So in Homer, the Underworld is the Underworld, and what I mean by that is there's no specific place where the good go or the bad go. Everyone is pulled into the same environment. Whereas with Virgil, he partitions the Underworld, which is the first time it's happened in literature up to this point. If you're evil, then the left pass sends the wicked to their punishment in godless Tartarus. Tartarus is the name given to, I suppose, hell is how we might know it now. And he says people who loathe brothers, beat parents, sit on gold, and they mentioned that those who sit on gold is the biggest group. So hoarding cash was just as much of an issue back then as it is now, way before Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. Menelaus burst in with Ulysses, the father of all crime. I'm mentioning this because it's all part of Virgil reframing this story. Ulysses was a hero before, and now Virgil's saying that he's the father of all crime because he's a trickster. And the Odyssey disappeared from culture for hundreds of years, partly because of, well, it's thought to be partly because of the view that Virgil set out in this book. But there were good people, and the good people went to the sweet green groves held by the fortunate, known as Elysium, and the Champs-Élysées in France is named after the Elysium. And here you have priests who lead good lives, and you also have Anchises, who's Aeneas' father. And when we meet Aeneas' father, we then get told about Augustus again. So Anchises is Aeneas' father, Augustus is Caesar Augustus, and Augustus says, "This is the man of whom so often you have heard the promise, who will bring gold once again to Latium." So we're seeing the circular view of history here. This is the longest passage that I've got. It's the one that everyone discusses, and it's towards the end of his trip down to the Underworld. And I'll read it out. So he goes, "2 gates, the silent house of sleep adorn, of polished ivory here, there of transparent horn. True visions through transparent horn arise, through polished ivory past deluding lies. Of various things discoursing as he passed, Anchises hither bent his steps at last. Then through the gate of ivory he dismissed his valiant offspring and divining guest." And what this is getting at, we look at the 2 items in blue. He's saying that there are these 2 gates that allow you to leave the Underworld. And one of them is polished ivory, and the other one is transparent horn. And if you go through the transparent horn, that's true visions. That's a true reality. Whereas if you go through the polished ivory, it's all lies. It's more of a dream world. So various things discoursing as he passed. Anchises, so the father, hither bent his steps at last. He reaches a rest. And then through the gates of ivory, ivory being the one with the deluding lies, he dismissed his valiant offspring, Aeneas, and divining guest. So it's quite extraordinary that he said his son Aeneas goes through the gate of lies. And people have been discussing what this means for centuries after centuries. And to me, if we take the first line, you know, he's said that there are true visions, and he's also said that there are deluding lies. So that makes it clear to me that Virgil believes in truth. If he's made the distinction that there is either or, you can get truth. But at the same time, if he sent his main characters, protagonists, back through the ivory past, then to me it's Virgil acknowledging that a story is a story. Yes, he thinks that he wants to say that Augustus is the man of whom you've heard, but he's writing a book, and he doesn't want people to feel like he believes that this is gospel truth. So I can't quite get the words, but that's what he's trying to say. And finally, so Aeneas goes in a Trojan, he comes out a Roman, and the reason for that is that he comes out with this new sense of purpose that he's going to be the founder of Rome. So Virgil's idea is a precursor to more modern themes. This is the penultimate slide. So Aeneas learns in the Underworld of souls that have another life. And this sort of baffles him. And the reason why there are souls is that they're going up to participate in the building of the great Roman Empire. Of course, this is Virgil being true to Augustus's vision. But there is also an interpretation that this reveals Virgil's pantheistic worldview. And pantheism is the idea that God is in everything and everything is in God. There's no separation between God and the universe. And as a result, nothing can ever be destroyed because it all continues. So you can imagine, if you take a pantheistic worldview, the soul never truly disappears into the underworld. It all comes back. It all remains as part of the totality. And this idea was made more clear by Spinoza and the Romantic poets, who were pantheists. They loved nature. Another line, at this they set to work at once, splitting up the tasks. This one jumped out at me because I thought about the division of labour. Now, I'd first read about it with Adam Smith, and he's certainly the man who is famous for this idea, but it was already written about 2,000 years ago in the Aeneid. And then finally, my cruel son, you left me. Is this the comfort you kept for my old age? And she's referencing her son who died in battle, and he's got this decision to make. Do I go and fight for Rome, or do I go, or in that stage he's fighting for the Trojans, or do I look after my mother who needs my help? And he chooses Rome. And here we've got family versus country, like which duty is more important. And I'm linking it now to Jean-Paul Sartre. He has a story where he talks about a man who's a French man who's trying to decide whether or not to fight for the French resistance against the Nazis. And on the one hand, he can go and have a small impact with a big problem, or he can stay at home and look after his mother and have a big impact on one individual. So you've got almost like an identical problem to that which is set out by Virgil in the Aeneid. And Sartre, when he brings it up, he's saying if you try and apply Christian ethics, love thy neighbour and be pious in a individual sense, you don't find an answer. Similarly, he talks about Kantian ethics, which I don't know well enough to describe here, but you can't find an answer through that. He doesn't say, well, what would Virgil think on this matter? He could have. But ultimately, Sartre says you have to trust your instincts. And that's one of the main points in existentialism, is you can't find a rigid system by which to live your life. You live your life, and through that, you discover what you at least see as being good and just and beautiful. Closing thoughts. Virgil wants to build on Homer's legacy. He's made that clear from the first line. And he tells this story of Rome rising out of a fall, the fall of Troy, that you have a descent, and out of the descent you come up out of the ashes. He develops a more complex underworld to introduce Elysium that rewards the good. And now let's look at the characters. So first of all, we've got Achilles in the Iliad, who's known as the greatest. He's the fastest, he's the strongest, that's the hero. Then we've got Hector, who is a Trojan, defeated by Achilles. He's not the best man, he knows he's not the best man, but he's brave. Aeneas is also a Trojan. He's not as good as Hector. He's not as brave as Hector, he's not as strong as Hector, otherwise he would have been the one put forward to fight against Achilles in the earlier episode. But now we've got Aeneas, who's the most pious. So in each instance, we're grounding the hero. We're going from greatest to bravest to most pious. And their feet are standing on the ground. They're then becoming more relatable. And let's remember that the Aeneid was written between 29 and 19 BC, which is only 30 years before the Bible arrives, when we have Jesus, the carpenter, who is on the way. And in the next talk, we'll be looking at Dante's Inferno, which is more of a Christian worldview. Yeah, last line. I just like this line. Rumour, swiftest of all evils, she thrives on speed and gains strength as she goes. As a storyteller, Virgil here again is understanding that the truth that we hold on to is not necessarily the truth, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a crack at it.